Thank you, Sandro, for this very kind introduction, and I'd also like to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this meeting. It actually means a lot to me to be here because Stephen Gould and his work had been very influential on my career and my own thinking in Evo-Devo, evolutionary developmental biology. I cannot claim, as others can in this room, to have been a very close friend of Stephen Gould's, but I knew him a bit. This is not only because we met at a few conferences, such as Dahlem conferences in Berlin, but primarily because I spent a sabbatical year at Harvard. And my room was placed in the Museum of Comparative Zoology and was in fact a few doors down the corridor from Stephen Gould. And so I had the occasion to meet him. We had some very nice talks, very inspiring talks, I would like to say. And in addition to that, I can claim to be probably the only one in this room, or one of very few, who have actually sat in and listened throughout his introductory course for undergraduates at Harvard University, where I sat in as a visitor. And I remember this course vividly. He was a brilliant teacher, of course. And I also remember vividly his excursions into other subjects of society and politics and everything, amongst others into sports and baseball. And on one occasion, he threw up a picture like this on the screen, and he asked the audience in the hall whether anyone knew who this was. And of course, these were very young kids in their first or second year in the 80s, and they didn't know. So I shouted out, "Joe DiMaggio," you know, and he didn't know that it had been me, so he smiled. And I like to think he thought there was at least one person in the audience worthy to become an evolutionary biologist. At the time, I spent my sabbatical actually with Per Ahlberg. And Per Ahlberg was at the time the youngest Harvard professor. He was an evolutionary and developmental biologist, curator of herpetology. He had this position possibly not without influence of Steve Gould, because they were very close and had collaborated. And I'd like to say that there is another connection to Venice in this, because after my sabbatical I met Per very frequently in Europe and many times in Venice. And in fact, we called Harry's Bar, whom you might know, our office, where we would discuss development and evolution. Per and Steve Gould and George Oster and David Wake had a paper together in 1979, which I regard as one of the foundational papers in Evo-Devo theory. There were a few others, but this was a crucial one because it laid out a methodology, a quantitative methodology for how to go on study heterochrony and other processes in Evo-Devo. So this was very important, and it occurred long before the discovery of Hox genes. Yet if you look at modern revisionist histories of Evo-Devo, you can find claims such as these, where the origin of Evo-Devo is linked to a methodological event, to the discovery of Hox genes and their visualization in embryos. And these claims go even further, and I could throw up many of these, where Hoxology, so to speak, is claimed to be at the origin of the research field, of the entire research field of Evo-Devo. Now, I'd like to go into what I, in the beginning, shortly, briefly, into what I truly believe are the beginnings of Evo Devo and Steve Gould's role, very influential role in this. And then go on, discuss some of the concepts that were influential and discuss their status today, some of Gould's concepts also. And finally, summarize what I think it means for evolutionary theory today. Now, we all know that in the end of the 70s and the early 80s, besides the modern synthesis argument that is well known, criticism has started to rise, and Steve Gould had been one of the most outspoken critics, even though Niles Eldredge has pointed out quite correctly that he believed in adaptation, of course, and in natural selection and in genetic variation. But he criticized the standard theory for a number of things it couldn't do. The standard theory was a theory about variation. It was based on measuring variation in phenotypes and associating it with assumed genetic variation, and it was used to explain population variation in evolution. However, it couldn't do a number of things that are listed here, such as explaining why not all of evolution is incremental and steady in small steps. We have heard this today already. It had also been mentioned that not all features of organisms are adaptive. Contingency was not part of it, and especially the generation of complex phenotypes and macroevolutionary events was not part of the modern. It's not a criticism of what was there. The modern synthesis wasn't designed to explain these things, and this is what Steve Gould had criticized. And so this was an explanatory deficit, so to speak, that existed and was recognized at the time. And on the other hand, there was a formal deficit in the evolutionary account, and this was that the standard synthesis related variation at the genotype space directly with variation at the phenotype space. And of course, it was then argued that there is something in between that transforms and interprets and translates genetic information into what would become phenotypic characters. And this field, actually, which by Waddington had been called the epigenetic space, became the field of evolutionary developmental biology at the time. It was studied empirically, experimentally, and descriptively by many different approaches before the tool of in situ hybridization and gene regulatory expression visualization had been around, and it resulted in the foundational volumes of evolutionary developmental biology, such as the Bonner volume 82, 83, 85, and even the volume that was giving the name to the entire field by Brian Hall in 1992, doesn't even mention Hox genes. It was about concepts and about patterns and constraints and heterochrony and all these things, but it wasn't about gene regulatory evolution. And then, of course, came the discovery of regulatory genes, of methods to visualize them, and that gave a great boost to Evo Devo. And today, you could say that maybe 90% of all of the empirical work in Evo Devo is probably in this area. This has changed a lot. However, I'd like to point out one very important aspect, namely that Evo Devo consists of two interlinked sets of questions. And the whole question of gene regulatory evolution in development is related to the upper area. It's about how development evolves and how how changes at the genetic and cell and tissue level actually are realized and transform embryos. However, the second set of questions, it's this lower error set of questions. This is about how the properties of developmental systems actually influence the dynamics of evolutionary change. And this was the set of questions that Stephen Gould was mostly interested in. He was interested in what role development actually plays in evolution. So, which ones are the concepts that he used and that were influential in the foundation of EvoDevo, and then I quickly try to sketch how these concepts have changed and whether they're still in use today or in which way they're still in use. Let's start with heterochrony. Heterochrony, of course, is the evolutionary shift of developmental timing, of developmental processes, Steve Gould was primarily interested in the aspects of heterochrony that were able to dissociate it between changes in size and shape. Shape actually was a proxy for development and size for growth over time. That was his approach. And of course, this was placed on various kinds of possibilities to modify the timing of developmental events by evolutionary processes, and in principle you could look at such things like the rate of a developmental process, the onset of a developmental process, the offset of a developmental process, the beginning, the ending, and the relative variations of it, and these changes could give rise essentially to two kinds of modifications of the phenotype, either pedomorphic changes so that the phenotype would look more juvenile, or paramorphic changes, that means that development proceeds beyond the limits of the precursor system. And that was studied in all its aspects. In genetics, you could show that gene expression here in two species of yeast had temporal dissociations in expression patterns, earlier onset, later onset, and so on. It was studied with all kinds of organ systems. There's entire books that have lists through all taxa that show heterochronic change, and here you have 7 vertebrate traits, and you can see by the colored points the relative changes in onset of the development of these characters. So there is a whole multitude of studies that studied this. And then, of course, in hominid evolution, which always had been a primary example of heterochrony and the effects of heterochrony on evolutionary change, this is now studied with modern means in 3-dimensional geometric, morphometric algorithms, and it shows that if you look at this, that these ontogenetic trajectories of the skulls have a ground pattern of the great apes that are very similar and overlapping, whereas the orangutans and the humans deviate, and the humans are the most pedomorphic and the orangutans the most paramorphic primates in this study. And these are very nice results, of course. However, even the authors of this study, in fact, a member in my department, show that not all changes in hominid evolution and in the skull evolution can actually be attributed to heterochrony. They are critical of this aspect. And and rightly so, because there remains a fundamental problem in heterochrony studies, and that is how can you be sure that these changes were actually causal in the modification in the evolutionary modification they triggered, because any kind of change that affects development, whether it's genetic or developmental or direct environmental induction or selectional processes, they always will cause modifications of relative timing in embryonic development, and therefore it's very tricky to distinguish out those cases in which the timing chain had been the initial change. Anyhow, what I mean to say is heterochrony is still around. It's studied by various means at all levels of developmental biology. However, the interest in heterochrony has waned somewhat, I would say, not because it's wrong, but because of these inherent difficulties, and also because everybody now accepts this as a given case, and so it's no more at the center of evo-devo studies. The next problem, or the next concept, very much supported, introduced, and defended by Steve Gould, is developmental constraint, of course. I give here not Gould's discussion. He never has such a clear definition, but rather Maynard Smith's discussion, and it points out that constraints are seen as biases or limitations on phenotypic variability caused by the developmental system. And this emphasized somewhat the negative side of constraints and the limitational side. And Steve Gould had always argued that there is a positive side to constraint. So, as I said, methodologies were developed to look at ontogenetic trajectories, and if any of these parameters of a hypothetical morphospace would be changed, the ontogenetic trajectory itself would change accordingly. This is somewhat based on the earlier morphospace concept introduced by David Raup, where in a hypothetical three-dimensional morphospace of phenotypes, you would see that most of phenotypic variation would cluster on one side or in one corner, or depending on what feature or organism you look at, and so which gave rise to the notion that the morphospace is not, or the phenotypic space is not, fully explored. Although there could be variation in certain spaces, it didn't occur or is constrained and limited. And we worked ourselves in this domain of constraints. I had looked at the constraints of digit variation, and you can see on this brief example that, for example, when you have selection on size reduction of the limbs, a certain sequence of loss of digits results. No matter what you do, this is the morphocline with a very specific disappearance of digits. And you can induce the same kind of digit loss experimentally by using mitotic inhibitors that reduce the size of the embryos. And this shows, I'm very short on this, this shows that the selectional change on size variation, for example, can be very unspecific. It can favor smaller limbs, but the specific morphological consequence, the outcome of this change, is provided by the propensities of the developmental system, in this case the limb system, and therefore certain digits will disappear first, and then the next, and the next, and all this has kinds of thresholds. I'm going to return to this. But it is also shown by nice papers that developmental constraints also constrain genomic evolution, or what can be maintained in genome evolution. This shows that early development, of course, as everybody would intuitively assume, genomic changes are lethal, much more lethal. Therefore, there is less genome variation that affects earlier development than genome variation that affects later development. So developmental constraints work not only at the level of development itself, but also influence other levels of evolution. However, the discussion then in Evo Devo has slightly shifted exactly as Steve Gould had predicted, namely towards the positive or generative aspects of developmental constraints. This has been most rhetorically, most brilliantly argued by Mark Kirschner and John Gerhardt in their various publications and their volume. And they show that due to the high epigenetic interconnectedness of developmental features, the number of regulatory changes that are required to perform a certain modification of the phenotype are reduced. They increase the variety of regulatory targets and reduce the lethality of genetic change and so on, and increase the amount of genetic variation that can be retained in a population. This is a very important argument, for example, you can show that all kinds of beak variation in certain birds can actually be realized by the modification in the expression amount of two morphogens, namely BMPs, the bone morphogenetic proteins, especially BMP4, and the calmodulins. One is more important for the length of the beak, and the other is more important for the width of the beak. And through the modification of these two morphogens, as they used to be called, proteins, the various kinds of variation of beak can be realized, and all the other features that are integrated with beak size change, such as muscles and tendons and blood vessels and whatnot, they automatically follow suit. And therefore, the old idea that evolutionary change has to wait around until enough genetic variation is available for the accompanying interconnected tissues, and everything has to wait until there is enough variation available for natural selection to act on it, is not necessary. It works very rapidly due to the high interconnectedness provided by development. So in this case, in the cases of developmental constraints, the discussion has shifted now from constraint more to the term of evolvability. Evolvability being the capacity of a population to generate heritable phenotypic variation, and this is much attributed now not only to genetic variation but also to developmental variation and its integrated capacities. And an important aspect of this is the modular organization of developmental systems, the genetic modularity, but also the developmental modularity, which permits important dissociations in development, so that natural selection can see or target, so to speak, one module versus the other module, something that the dissociability is something that was also already mentioned by Steve Gould. Third, the spandrels. here defined as the production of non-adaptive structures by developmental correlation with selected features. And interestingly enough, spandrels is not a term that has taken very much in Evo-Devo. The use of the term is infrequent. However, in the recent years, maybe in the last decade or so, another aspect has been targeted in Evo-Devo research that kind of brings back the idea of spandrels, and this is innovation and novelty in evolution. Where do novel features actually come from? How are they generated by the developmental system? Has been a new and intriguing question, and many believe that this is the real issue in which Evo-Devo will be able to make a substantial contribution to evolutionary theory. Now, innovation has been recognized as a problem already a long time ago. Even Darwin mentions it, and actually says this could be a kind of change that is quite different, as he says, from natural selection. But Ernst Mayr explained the problem within the standard modern synthesis view, namely that you had to wait around until enough small gene mutations can be accumulated in order to make the structure sufficiently large so that natural selection could act on it. So to make a long story short, Evo-Devo has seized on this problem, and the first thing is that it must be defined what is an innovation. Is this something that is different from the standard variation? Does it constitute a problem in itself, or what is it? And I cannot go through the definitions and all that, but I'd like to point out that we're dealing with different kinds of things when we're talking about innovation, such as primary multicellular assemblies that would be at the base of first kinds of body plans, the introduction of new elements into an existing body plan, or major variations that especially have functional consequences in organisms, and so we designated different types of innovations and so on. But the most important aspect is that the introduction of new features or of primary multicellular assemblies is an emergent feature of either cells coming together or of developmental systems being under selective constraint. And so I think probably the battery is dying down. No, not really. Interesting. There's another one here. Maybe I can use this. Let's see. It works. So, and one of of those people who work on innovation, one of their principal argument is that it is the nonlinear dynamics of developmental systems that, when they come under selection, react with threshold reactions that are not, if you like, foreseen by the selectional process. Developmental biology is full all over of nonlinear effects, such as the activation of this active form of the YAN protein in Drosophila embryos depends on a gradual concentration diffusion of the MAP kinase, and at a certain point it switches from the inactive to the active form. And you have many such examples, and you can imagine if you have a continuous selectional process acting on one of these systems, the reaction will never be just a gradual effect. It will come to a threshold limit where there is a switch that's either lethal or will provide something new. So there is thresholds effects even on those kinds of innovation that we have called variational kinds of innovation, such as in these beetles, the dung beetles, the famous dung beetles that have changes in horn size or thorax width. And if you look at these graphs, you can see that some aspects of the body are in some body parts, the variation is gradual and continuous. But then there is other body parts where you have a kind of threshold effect, such as in the horns or in thorax width. So the response of the developmental system is not gradual, even if the selective inducer has gradual content. The same you can see in a great number of tissues in the body, such as cartilage formation, where the amount of collagen that is expressed by the connective tissue cells that will form cartilage depends on the number of connective tissue cells that come together. When they reach a certain threshold size, they switch to cartilage production. You can do a lot of things with this. We have, for example, worked on the limb patterning system, and I cannot go into the details of this model that we have developed, but it works with these autonomous switching on of cartilage production. And it shows that changes in width and length of the limb bud will automatically result in new, more or less cartilage nodules that are being produced. This means that also evolution can act on such proportions, but the bony elements, the later bony elements, are provided by the system as an automatic response by itself, you see also the threshold effects in this. For example, if you enlarge limb buds, either by mutation or by transgenic experiments or whatever environmental change you may be able to think of, the result, in fact, is full digits that are added. It's not a minor, gradual, continuous enlargement of the hand or the foot, but you see that in all these cases, additional full digits are being added. This is not a gradual response. This is a threshold response that can switch on. And a final example is of this another type of this spandrel effect, if you like, probably took place in early metazoan development when unicellular forms came together or failed to separate, stick together, and the kind of primary assemblies that can be generated out of the properties that these cells had evolved before they came multicellular. They had certain proteins that were present in their cell walls and so on. You bring these together in the multicellular context, a certain kind of assembly can result, such as these spherical forms or elongated forms or hollow forms. These are results of the physical properties of the cells coming together and not of a selectional event. Now selection can act on these. Now selection can fixate, stabilize, make these morphologies more faithful, if you like. But the primary forming effect, so to speak, is a physical result of the of cells that are endowed with certain proteins in their cell walls, and when they come together and stick together can form certain assemblies, something that has been called a vocabulary of forms, and it's a limited vocabulary again. So Also, in the case of spandrels, the actual work, the empirical work, has moved on. There is different terms being used, and there is different processes and factors that are being discussed and researched. But the basic idea of spandrels is still around. Now, these are not the only kind of concepts that had been generated in the Evo-Devo field. Just point out there's many others, and that are not so intimately linked to Steve Gould's ideas. But the question now is, has this had any effect on evolutionary theory at all? And you know, of course, that Steve Gould had argued for what he called a revised and expanded theory of evolution on multiple occasions. And the question would be, of course, what did he understand by that? What is a revised and expanded theory of evolution? And he was very clear about that. He kind of said that it will stress a variety of themes that have either been ignored or explicitly rejected by the modern synthesis, such as punctuational change, non-adaptive change at all levels, not only selection but equally constraints, development and architecture, thus restoring to evolutionary theory a concept of organisms. So this is how he viewed the expanded kind of theory. Of course, it is surprising and almost a kind of a scandal that today, still, after so many years of empirical work and substantiation of most of these concepts, it is still possible to say that all is well with the modern synthesis. 70 years, more or less, after its conception, where all these changes have happened, such as DNA had been discovered, and genes and genomes, and there is all the omics revolution and everything. But there are some firm believers that the old theory is still the same. Nothing has changed, which is surprising, at least. What did Stephen Gould's expanded theory consist of? Now, of course, what is not mentioned here is he did believe in the standard mechanisms of variation, natural selection, inheritance, and adaptation, of course. But in addition, he meant to introduce the three agents of variation that are related to developmental processes, and that I've briefly reviewed, and you could call these the mechanisms that produce a variation, and he would have seen these in concert with mechanisms that fixate these kinds of variations, such as hierarchical selection, exaptation, and contingency, historical accident, so this is not surprising, and by many Evo-Devo scientists is fully accepted today. They do not challenge these views, in fact. Less so by the population geneticists, of course, that are not entirely happy with this kind of view. We have collected a year ago a number of these new concepts, either the classical alternative concepts, but also those that I have now summarized under their new names, such as innovation or facilitated variation, modularity, evolvability, and so on. And we have, in addition to the Gouldian factors, also taken into account genomic evolution, epigenetic inheritance, and the important concept of niche construction. We have summarized this under the term of the extended synthesis, not because anyone is calling for a new theory of evolution or a new synthesis or something, but because we realize that most evolutionary biologists are working with concepts and theories today that were not part of the synthesis, and therefore it's wrong to claim that this is the appropriate name for the theoretical framework still today. Now, of course, I'm saying there is not just a numerical addition of concepts. My claim is that the introduction and integration of these concepts has actually influenced the logical structure and the logical argument of evolutionary theory also. And I briefly illustrate this with 2 slides, even though it's very difficult. If you look at the standard traditional modern synthesis theory, there is variation in populations, and this variation is caused by the underlying variation in gene pools. Natural selection acts from the outside on these populations, and there is genetic inheritance that transmits genetic information from one generation to the next, and there is a continuous environment. Taking into account all these concepts that I have now mentioned, the picture looks very different. Don't be worried about all the arrows and everything. I'd just like to show you that evolutionary theory has become much more complex now. The argument has become much more complex. Especially variation in the populations of phenotypes is now seen not as a result only of genetic variation, but as a result of what you could call a developmental systems pool. Developmental systems, including the epigenetic processes of development, determine what kinds of variations can occur in the populations. There is not only individual level selection, but multi-level selection. And then there is a reciprocity here that had not been present before, and that is because organisms, the phenotypes, can actively transform the environment, which becomes the selective environment for the next generation. And then also there is another arrow here, because it has been shown that environmental change can directly affect developmental systems of a whole population. And Mary Jane West Eberhard has made this argument and has called it environmental induction. Finally, you see now there is only not one sort of inheritance, not only genetic inheritance, but also epigenetic inheritance, behavioral inheritance, and cultural inheritance that need to be taken into account. Cannot go into the details how this is being done, but what I mean to say, simply looking at these pictures, you see that evolutionary theory has become much more multifactorial, much more pluralistic than it had been before. Finally, I'm ending with some future challenges, and only can go a little bit into this. I believe that all that has been said so far needs now to be formally integrated into evolutionary theory. It's nice to have examples and have arrows and boxes, but the formal structure of the evolutionary needs to be, of course, supplemented by mathematical analysis and algorithms that integrate these kinds of processes. So one of them is still a desideratum, namely to develop a quantitative theory or quantitative models that take into account multi-level selection. David Sloan Wilson is one of the most outspoken exponents of advocates of a multi-level selection theory, and therefore it is now time that people actually, some actually do take into account maybe 2 levels of selection, but as we can see, there's possibly many more levels of selection that need to be accounted for. More or less the same thing is required in inheritance. There is, these several 4 different levels of inheritance that I'd shown in my diagram can be and have been integrated into what has been called inclusive inheritance. In fact, by a very nice paper last year by Etienne Danchin, and there is certainly other ways to do this, but algorithms for accounting for inclusive inheritance actually exist already. And finally, in Evo-Devo, we also need quantitative measurements, especially if we want to integrate Evo-Devo with population-level accounts. And in our own lab, we're working on three-dimensional measurements of embryos that are done with a new technique, micro-CT, and which we apply to embryos, and they give not only wonderful and colorful pictures, but what you can do is you study many embryos of the same stage of development, and you can measure variation in embryonic development and apply algorithms of population level accounts to this. And finally, what we are also aiming to do, or have already done to some extent, is relating quantitative gene expression, not which gene is turned on and turned off where in the body, but how much of the gene product is actually being expressed in certain areas of the embryo, and what the cellular and tissue level reactions are to these differences in the amount of gene expression. I believe this is also an important thing that will be able to bring together the quantitative accounts for evolutionary theory. And so I'd like to end by saying that I do believe that Stephen Gould's work and his concepts have actually been very influential in the founding of the whole discipline of evolutionary developmental biology, and I believe also that evolutionary theory has moved on. We are faced with a different kind of theoretical framework today, one that is, as I've said, more pluralistic than the ones that were in use before, and I believe this is what Steve Gould actually had desired. Thank you very much.